Allan Chase, and this is Coffee Talk.
Everybody, I'm Kim Perlak. I'm the chair of the guitar department. Welcome to an episode of our Coffee Talk. We have Allan Chase here, who's the chair of the ear training department. Allan, welcome.
It's good to see you. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
And we've got Cheryl Bailey, as usual, assistant chair. Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, everybody. Unfortunately, I don't have my fancy Berkeley cup, but it does say have a smashing date, and it has a guitar on it, so I hope that's okay.
That's great. Does it have a guitar and a piñata?
And a cactus. Yeah, it's very festive.
That's great. And Ian Steed, our senior department coordinator. Hey, Ian.
Hey, how's it going?
Good to see you. Allan, thank you so much for being on Coffee Talk today.
It's my pleasure.
So you already had your coffee, you were saying?
I did, yeah. I had plenty of coffee today, so I'm not drinking it right this minute. I just have my water here.
What was it though? What'd you have this morning? We're very interested to see what everybody's drinking.
I had the French press medium dark roast, ground it last night, so I didn't have to make a lot of noise this morning. And I had a little soy creamer and silk unflavored soy creamer and 1 teaspoon of sugar. That's how I do it. Yeah.
I like this. See, it makes sense.
2.5 cups.
It makes sense that someone who's a composer and a performer and a person who knows about the ear is that detailed, I think.
I wasn't sure how much you needed to know about my
I think that was great. It was really good. Very similar to the metal coffee of Joe Stump, actually, in a lot of ways. So that's great.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm interested.
Yeah. So, Allan, one of the reasons we wanted to have you here is because of the really deep connection between developing your ear and developing your skills on your instrument. And so I think we wanted to start kind of where we start with everybody, which is you've had a long history with Berkeley and a lot of first days there. What was one of your first days like when you were at Berkeley?
Well, I'll never forget my first day teaching at Berkeley. This could be the whole interview, because I had a first time I walked into Berkeley when I inquired about being a student, but I was not a student at Berkeley. So that story doesn't really have such a great happy ending. But anyway, and then I already had a degree at that point. Basically, I went up to an admissions window and they told me that I would have to be a freshman again and take all the freshman classes. So I didn't know how it worked, This was in 1980. In 81, I was hired to teach at Berkeley. I was taking graduate courses at New England Conservatory, and the now head of the Boston Musicians Union, Pat Hollenbeck, was my teacher. And he said, well, you should teach this at Berkeley. I had a composition degree. And they hired me. They were interested kind of over the summer when I applied, and said, well, it'll depend on enrollment. We probably have enough faculty. But in August, I got a call for some more interviews, and I got hired by Ted Pease and Alex Ulanovsky, the heads of arranging and harmony. And I taught a very heavy load of part-time. It was called part-time. It was 25 hours, contact hours of classroom teaching a week, 5 days a week, 5 hours a day, and a meeting every day. 4 days a week. My first hour was teaching species counterpoint. I prepared a lecture that I thought was bulletproof. It had the history of species counterpoint, talked about Zarlino and, all kinds of obscure theoretical topics. And I very quickly realized this is not appropriate at all when I started interacting. I gave like almost an hour lecture, and then we started doing stuff on the board, and I'm like, I love these students and I love teaching and I'm so excited to be here, but I actually was immensely relieved. Like, I don't have to do an hour lecture on the history of music theory every week. What I need to do is connect with the students and talk about intervals and melody and, there were more basic things that we needed to work on. And the first student I interacted with was a woman about my age, which was 25, who was wearing completely black leather and was a guitarist. And she was like a gigging rock guitarist. I wish I remembered her name. I could look it up. But, I had come from like a composition degree at a state university and then New England Conservatory. So it was a different vibe in terms of stylistic diversity. And I liked that, so.
I wonder with the way that you first encountered teaching ear training and the way you've developed it as a faculty member and then as the chair, it seems like it really connects really deeply with the way that you play and with your performance career as a saxophonist. Could you talk a little bit about like the real practical interactions if something really stood out to you when you're thinking about teaching ear training? Like what are the things you felt like you developed in the curriculum that reflected what you needed as a player?
Well, the thing that's that's a deep question. So the thing that's so important to me and that I've tried to emphasize since I've been chair, and it's just grown in clarity and importance to me gradually over the whole time I've been a musician, is the connection between the ear and the instrument, between inner hearing, which is a kind of long-term memory, but it's a complicated kind of long-term memory because it's not in a way it's relative pitch for most people. And it's not a memory of a specific thing, it's a memory of relationships. If you think about it, like how does the sound relate to the tonic, which may be one of 12 different notes in any octave, that kind of thing. So, and that's just talking about single pitches. But when I started to get a handle on that and to be able to hear things in my head, it took me out of the world of just trying to pass ear training as a student and as a musician and into the wonderful, mysterious, creative world of trying to play what you hear and trying to hear what other people are playing and to interact with them live and to, not just search for notes, trying up to 12 until you get the right answer, multiple choice, but to actually have a little stronger hypothesis about what you're trying to hit, and to the point where you're really confident. I mean, a point I just comes to mind in saying that I want to emphasize is it's not just about like having better inner hearing connection with your sense of pitch, better recognition, and kind of being able to imagine a pitch. It makes your time better and your tone better. And to me, that is so important because, and I think sometimes we think of it, we don't, until you've experienced that, maybe you don't really know how true it is. But when you're confident, like on saxophone, and I imagine this is true on guitar, when you pull the string or when you put air through the horn, if you are pretty sure what the pitch that's about to come out is and your fingers didn't just go to it and hope, then you play it with a certain physical energy that is confident. And when you feel inwardly unsure, especially when you're improvising and you're inwardly unsure that the next note is going to sound the way you imagined it, if you're thinking just kind of in terms of an upward gesture instead of a specific pitch, you have this little hesitation in your time. And so you can't really groove when you have no idea what you're about to hit, what note's about to come out, to be extreme about it.
That's a funny thing because oftentimes I say to my student, think about the Mona Lisa. Leonardo didn't just get a bunch of buckets of paint and start throwing it at the wall and it appeared. There had to be, obviously there was craft and understanding perspective and technique, but there was a vision inside that he saw, and it was very purposeful. And to develop your craft in a way where you have all those skills that you can be purposeful in what the notes you choose, which I think is, as an improviser, that's the fun because you're always hearing things that you can't play, and that keeps you coming back. But just going back to the thing of being hearing something. You have to have an idea that you hear instead of just moving your fingers and you hope something good's going to come out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's the amazing process of working on your ear, and having the faith and the discipline to work on your ear, because I don't, it's not always the most tangible thing. So I just wonder what you, in that, discussing that with students or developing that with students, okay, trying to get to this place of what do you hear, and trying to keep, bringing them back all the time, because it is to have that faith. You don't necessarily see, day to day an improvement, right? You might go through periods where you feel like you're going nowhere. At least that was for me. So, what are your thoughts on that in terms of keeping students inspired to keep coming back and work on, because there's something that they hear in there, and to develop those skills that it can become more clear that they actually understand what they hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that ability to keep going with it is about pacing and how difficult the challenges are that you create for yourself. Just like you have to practice something slow to play it fast, and that's true in like sports training and reprogramming yourself if you wanted to be a dancer, and it's true in instrumental technique, and it's also true in ear training. You have to focus on a limited number of things that you can build on, and then take a small amount of time with like really clear mental focus, and you have to do it regularly. And if you do that, I believe almost every person can get to the point where they have, a really good usable level of skill in musical hearing. I've almost never met a student who just couldn't do it for some reason, some neurological or physical reason that we couldn't put our finger on, or maybe could. Literally almost never, and I'm talking out of tens of thousands of students who have gone through the program, and we'll often see people who have really big challenges with it. And so, I mean, a couple of things I like to get out of the way. One is the belief in talent, inborn talent, and it often goes with perfect pitch or absolute pitch. Current research on that really is different from what I was taught kind of anecdotally as a young person. People used to say, oh, perfect pitch is inborn, only some people have it, 1 in 10,000. Just miraculously, this very round number of 1 in 10,000 people has perfect pitch. And I think, wow, I know 7 or 8 of them. That's odd, And what if you had perfect pitch and you weren't a musician? Like, would you know you had perfect pitch? Like how, like if 1 in 10,000 people has perfect pitch, that would be odd, especially if they didn't even live in the world of 12-note chromatic scale of equal temperament and so on. So obviously that doesn't make any sense scientifically. And finally, we've realized that absolute pitch is not 1 in 10,000. It's has to do a lot with how children use or don't use the skills, and it's more of a thing that some people retain. It seems to be retained in certain cultures, maybe cultures with tonal languages or cultures that do a lot of early childhood music education. And, it's still not really known. But that isn't the determining factor of whether you're going to be a good musician. So let's just put that aside. But the other thing is like, well, my friend is just really good at it, and I'm not. So I guess, I'm not an ear player or something like that. Well, your friend learned it, and you can learn it. Like babies don't just come out going like, yeah, that's C minor, They they learned it. Like they may not remember learning it. They may spend enormous amount of time fooling around with a musical instrument and kind of get a glimpse of like a system, and then kind of start to remember the notes and so on when they're very young. And so they, that what we call talent is often just work done early. I mean, there may be different aptitudes, but I really question how those things are tested and so on. I just think it's mostly about motivation. And if you can make it so it's fun to learn and you love it and you make progress, it will snowball until you're really good at it. It's not as hard to learn ear training as it is to learn French. And basically all people in France learned French. So it's just a matter of time and exposure, and lots of other people too. So I don't want to go on too long about that, but to me so for example, people will put on an app and it has 12 chord types and they'll go like, I only got 6 of them right. Well, I would stop them at that point and I'd go like, why don't you narrow it down to major and minor triads in root position and see if you can get 100% of those right. And if you missed one, let's try to figure out what's going on when you missed one. Maybe when you hear F major and then you hear A minor, you thought major because you were kind of feeling like it sounded like part of an F major 7 chord, So maybe it's not random that you made that mistake. Maybe it's actually an insight into how you're processing the sound in context. Things like that. And then, and then add something or take 2 things that are really different, like sus4 and diminished. And make sure you just totally get those like instantly. And like, okay, now I can put that aside, Just review it periodically and then start taking some. But if you try to do all of the stuff at once, of course you can't do it all, it's confusing. And, the method of practicing is often a problem. Like people are just practicing identifying things in isolation and then they don't recognize them in context. That's really different. Chords that, a minor chord that's the 6 minor chord sounds different from the 4 minor chord in a major key or the 1 minor chord. And it could be a surprise or it could not be a surprise depending on the context. So all these things are, you probably need a teacher and some help, because it's a lot to sort out, and that's what we're working on, is trying to help people.
Allan, I think that's great that you're talking about that process because I think it seems overwhelming and intimidating. And I think you're spot on in terms of, you can learn this and we break it down and there's a process to learning it. It's not some magical thing. You know what? I had a student one time, as I've worked with him a long time and he's worked on his ear. And as soon as he started to really be able to hear intervals and then these different chord progressions, he had a great way to describe it. He said, when I used to listen to music, it just sounded like soup, like a big blob. And I couldn't, and it is so similar to language, right? Because you mentioned about people speaking French or whatever. When you first start to even learn a language, you go, oh my God, they're speaking so fast, I don't know if I'll ever get it. And then you hang out with it and you start to work on it and you go, oh, that woman said something about her cat like, oh, how did I know how to do that? But it is that process you take step by step. And then that soup, all of a sudden, you can taste all the ingredients in it. Oh, there's some saffron in there, and there's some,
Right.
And so I think that's really important for students to know that you can do that, and there's a way to do it, and go over to Allan Chase at the ear training department, and they will help you out.
We have 33 people who are really devoted to it. I mean, the thing is, I always tell entering students, like every one of these people in our department none of them go home at night and go, what I do for a living is ear training. They're all musicians who teach ear training because it's a tool for music. They might be trying to get songs, country rock songs placed on television, or they might be writing classical music for, microtonal commissioned compositions. I have somebody writing a microtonal opera in my department, or playing jazz trumpet, or bluegrass. I mean, they do all kinds of different things. And ear training is a tool for them that they're passionate about and skilled about teaching. So they're always thinking about what we're talking about now, which is how do you apply it to your music. And they, last night, faculty members in my department who were all tired and working really hard and struggling, very successfully to teach remotely in this environment and doing a great job. But it's a lot of work, and yet they're sending me, have you ever heard this recording? Check this out. I transcribed this. I mean, somebody in my department, Jilson Shaknick, sent me a transcription of a movie theme. He's like, this is so interesting. It's, you know, it was one of the famous Italian movie composers. You know, and I mean, they can't stop. They love music, and ear training is a tool in music, you know.
See, that's what I think is really important. I mean, there are a couple things that struck me about what you're saying, but one that relates to Cheryl's comment is that it's almost like with ear training, I feel like we have a problem. There's like structuring how you're going to work on it, on your ear and on your instrument. And then there's the way you feel about it. And I think people are really afraid of ear training because they're afraid that if they don't get it right away, it means they're not a real musician and that they don't belong, and that scares them so much that they run away from it. And they hide from it. And then they sort of have this, then it also distorts reality, because instead of being able to see your ear training teacher as a musician who has a command of this tool in the way that your guitar teacher has a command of that tool, and you're all in the group together and you're just at different places and you're learning, you see this thing that's going to be discovered about you that will point out that you don't belong and that you should be kicked off the island by this person who's like keeping tabs on how well you do this horrible thing that you don't understand. You know what I mean? And that's not real. Like your ear training teacher is an incredible performer, composer, musician who has a command of teaching you this specific tool that is an integral part of you. And if you don't feel comfortable with it, it's not that you're bad at it, you're just unfamiliar. Right?
When another first day memory is probably, must have been one of my first meetings about teaching ear training that same week. And in those days, there wasn't, I mean, one of the things that's changed is I think we have a lot more overt conversation about a student-centered approach that is really trying to be friendly and helpful to students. And it was more of a tough love, like, you know, make it or head out, you know, attitude in the early days of my teaching experience, or at least that's how people kind of pretended to be. But although we did care very much about students. But what somebody said in that meeting was, there's two parts to ear training: fear training and ear straining. Fear training is when you have to sight sing in front of other people, and ear straining is when you have to do transcription and dictation and identification of chords and intervals. And it was like,
that's so helpful.
It sounds so unappealing, you know. And we all laughed, and we all knew, like, yeah. Okay. I mean, and it was, in a way, it was expressing an empathy for students. It's like, this is how students feel about it, and this is what we have to overcome, is this fear and straining feeling, and make it, you know, we did talk about making it fun and more accessible and more successful, but we really work on that now. That's really what we're all about as a department, what I hope the student experience is. But it's still, it is intimidating, and a lot of it comes from this false belief in inborn talent, or that you should have done it already. If you approach all your learning like, I should have learned this before and I'm ashamed, it's not very much fun to practice, you know?
Right.
It'd be better to kind of just reorient yourself and say, I know a lot of things. I got into this school or this situation. I enjoy music, but there are these other things that I need to strengthen a little bit, you know? And anybody can do it. There's, you know, this app, Couch to 5K. I am not an advertisement for this app, but my sister is. She went from never running to running a 5K, and it takes you step by step, and you have to approach ear training that way too. It's like little increments that anyone can do, pretty much, and then move forward, and don't give up. And if you're failing at ear training, probably you just made the problem too hard. I mean, if you want to learn to sight read, and you weren't a sight reading guitarist, you wouldn't go, well, I think I'll buy the Elliott Carter Second String Quartet and put it on my music stand and read the viola part. You know, that isn't where you'd start. You'd start with something that you could succeed at. You'd start with some half notes and getting your hand-eye coordination together. And you just need to do that with ear training and not be putting yourself down while you're doing it, but do something you can be about 85 to 95% correct at, and then increase the challenge when you've improved on that. Add one more thing.
I'm thinking about Ian, your experience, because you're a fairly recent alum and a performer, and so you've more recently gone through studying this very intensely at Berkeley and then applying it to your instrument. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about right now.
Yeah, I mean, so I studied for a number of years at a different place in California, and I had a really intense ear training and theory teacher. And when I came to Berkeley, I tested into 3.
Great.
So, and maybe some of the theoretical concepts were already like in my ear, but like it seems like there's another aspect of ear training that's just so helpful. Like to me, I loved ear training. Like it's, in my opinion, like one of the most underrated aspects of a Berkeley education, because it's not just about like training yourself to hear things, which is a huge component of it, but like the other side of it is that it's just the practice of practice in a way where, you're given these things to learn and you got to come in the next week and, nail them on the head, regardless of whether or not the theoretical concept. I mean, somebody who maybe can hear it in their head, are they going to look at that page and sight sing this exercise? You know what I mean? It's like to talk about this concept of, talent, right? Somebody who can go in there and already knows everything or whatever, in a way, like it's the people who are struggling and it's a challenge. It's like, that's you actually, making progress on it, right? Just like it would be for this exercise app. It's like that difficulty is like actually, you overcoming something, right? And that like to really learn something aside, because in our instruments, we get such a tunnel vision about the way we practice and our routines, the way we pick up the instrument. And ear training forces us to practice in a setting where we don't have, our, comfortable zone of this instrument that we're so familiar with.
Absolutely.
Allan, as Ian was talking there, I was thinking about some of the things that we've talked about together and with Cheryl about ear training being more than that's a major triad, that's a minor triad. It's also when you're playing, being able to really understand your sound and your tone and being able to hear how you sound. Like, can you really hear the differences in the gradations of your dynamics and your other parameters of sound, like the envelope of the notes that you play, whether they're staccato, legato, muted, anything like that, harmonics, all of that stuff, how that plays, your timbre, all these different things that are absolutely essential as a performer, right? Like the way you play a note is often just as important or more important than the notes you choose. And so I'm wondering how you've made those connections as a performer who then began teaching ear training, and how you help people who are younger and less familiar practice that aspect of performance ear training.
Yeah, that is such an important thing, and it's really important to me as a musician. It's really important in all kinds of music, absolutely, equally, although I would say that my awareness of it grew from doing like free improvisation and new music, avant-garde music, different names and subgroups of it. But that's where I really started to work with these other parameters of music, if you look at it that way, like timbre as something that I could vary, not just in a stylistically habitual way, but actually like change it on purpose, or the envelope of a sound, almost thinking the way like a electronic composer who's working from scratch with sounds would think, which I never really did, but in electronics. The interesting thing about ear training is and I usually talk to my students about exactly what you just said. In a way, the way that the Western music curriculum is organized, we kind of tend to sometimes filter things. So, and it's natural. I mean, if you want to talk about one thing, you kind of have to filter out some of the other things temporarily. But you just have to remember that that's temporary. In other words, if we're focused on the pitch of notes in the equal temperament system, and just identifying whether something is the tonic or the fifth or the third or the minor third, etc. In a way, we're ignoring timbre, Like if you're hearing that note on a vibraphone or a piano or a guitar, it doesn't really matter. We're not looking for that answer. We're looking for the answer of what frequency is it in relation to the tonality. And rhythms, sometimes we're looking for how does it fit into the notation grid, to the nearest 16th note. We're not worried about, are you a little behind the beat? You worry about that in ensemble, but in ear training, you're just basically rounding things off to accurate, notational accuracy or whatever. And then you have to kind of sometimes go like, I also need to experience music in a more complete way. I also need to I need to adjust my lens or that's a visual metaphor, I guess, but, sort of open myself up to hearing everything. I mean, to me, this is the wonder of all of this. This is why it stays inspiring, is that you can come at it from so many different places. Sometimes when something that happens to me often, it really fascinates me, is to hear music that I knew as a young person that I haven't heard in a while. Like I'll hear Paperback Writer by the Beatles, which I loved when I was 10, I guess it came out. I'm pretty old. And, I'd listened to that song on the radio and I thought it sounded amazing. But if you asked me, well, how many voices are singing in harmony, and are they double tracked, and what are the chord changes, and does it modulate? I wouldn't be able to tell you that, because when I was 10, I didn't know. So now when I hear it, I can hear both ways.
Right.
I can be like, oh, it takes me right back to when I was 10 years old, and I hear all the feelings and the general vibe of it. But then I can also go like, oh, that's an interesting reverb, That's kind of, yeah. I can listen to it from a production point of view, from a harmonic point of view. I could probably write it out in 15 minutes, if I, so it's like, it's almost surreal and overwhelming. And it's actually, people worry it's going to lose its mystery. No, it's like 10 times more mysterious to me now. Like, it's so vivid and it has so many different dimensions to it.
Well, that's interesting what you're saying, because I think that is the experience of the ear, that things that you listen to at one time. There were certain musicians that I couldn't listen to, like maybe someone like Allan Holdsworth when I was a Berkeley student, because I was really into, straight ahead jazz, and there was just too much information for me. I didn't turn it away because I thought it's a challenge, but it was too challenging. It was like, wow, I got to work too hard for that. But then, as years went by and I went out and experienced music and playing, then I went back and listened to that music and I could connect with it. And I think that's the thing. It's something you can't force, your awareness of that music. And you have to give it time, It's almost like, a seed you plant and you have to water it and be patient with it. Mm-hmm. And then there'll be some point where you come back and, wow, there's a flower there or whatever. And there were certain things that I remember I couldn't get my ear around. But I guess I was at that point, too, studying music. I realized that. So I said, well, okay, let me just, I have a lot of respect for it. And you come back later, and I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you, in that way you're talking about that, listening to the Beatles when you're a kid, you listen to it on one level, but then as you've experienced and learned, and listened to a lot of other music too, I think the more music that you listen to and expose yourself to, it just broadens your palette, if you think of your ear as a palette, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. You learn to hear more and to process it faster. And I don't just mean analyzing it, but also just to kind of just feel it, you know, because you can start to get it in chunks or something. Like when you hear Allan Holdsworth, it could just sound like a blur. It's not rhythmically defined in the same way that like straight ahead jazz is. I'm not saying it's less rhythmically defined. It's just more like it's different, you know, how the notes are laid out over the meter and stuff like that. I saw him once. Yeah, that was amazing with Tony Williams' Lifetime when I was in my early 20s.
Yeah,
that was a memorable gig.
I
there were things going on stage, and now I know Alan Pasqua, who was teaching, who was the keyboard player, is a faculty member in the Berkeley Global Jazz Institute. I've talked to him about that gig. He remembers it. But there were a lot of things going on that I couldn't mentally process, and I had a composition degree at that point. I'd probably just finished college and was playing jazz gigs for about 4 years and stuff, but it was just like frighteningly complex and fast and odd meters and polyrhythms, and you know, all these things were going on. It just I was blown away. And now, it still kind of blows me away, but I definitely hear more. And I don't think it ever ends. I mean, there's definitely things like, I'm 64 and I've been doing this. I really started learning about music beyond just like school band when I was about 14. I started like buying books about music and studying, you know, out of a book about jazz improvisation and, you know, reading history and all that kind of stuff, and listening to different kinds of music that I didn't know. Many kinds, and so that's 50 years, and I definitely have a pile of things I'm still trying to learn and work on, you know, and I definitely notice progress.
What I'm thinking about when you're talking about these experiences, and Cheryl, yours as well, is these skills when you're listening are so useful. And imagine all the students who are thinking about, you know, their next professional opportunity, or they're worried about their next audition. If you walk in to a session, if you walk into an audition, and you feel more and more familiar with these elements of music, then you feel at home. You have a foundation in an unfamiliar situation that forces you to adapt. You know, I'm thinking about work I did as a producer in the recording studio. And that was one of the first times I kind of realized my ear training had evolved. Like being in a session and being able to hear parts in a way that I could, you know, other people couldn't in the session, which is why I got hired for that job. And, you know, we often hear in the office, Allan, like students saying like, well, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to prioritize like working on guitar because I think that's how I'm going to build my connections. You know, I don't know about the ear training. I might like kind of, you know, minimize my attention there. And I always tell them that one of my best recommenders for like the job I have now was my ear training teacher and theory teacher from freshman year in college.
Wow.
Yeah, who was Kari Uselak. He became the dean,
right,
at Berkeley. But, you know, that was 15 years before, and I didn't know. I hadn't seen him in 15 years. And he said, oh, yeah, I heard you were applying. It's so great. And I told the committee all about what you were like as a ear training student. And I thought, oh no, like, what did you know about me? And it kind of, now it made sense as a musician now, but I think students, it would really blow them away to think that the person who's watching me learn these skills with my ear would know something about me holistically as a musician. And we know that's true. And so, like, what do you think you learn about the students? Like, what can you tell about them when you're teaching them ear training and watching their development in that way?
Yeah. I mean, you learn a lot about students. I understand. I mean, that's a lot. I'm taking in all the different aspects of what you're saying. I understand prioritizing you're playing and making that the focus. That's natural. I think you have to integrate these other things into it and see how they connect and not see them as isolated. You know, it's not arbitrary or just a hurdle that somebody put up. Part of the problem is unlearning what we learn often in high school as people who are artistic and musical and don't want to major in the main core subjects of high school. You know what I mean? I mean, if your profession isn't going to be engineering or maybe English editing or something like that, you know, then the subjects of like reading, writing, and arithmetic might seem like, I just need to get this done. I need to pass. I need to, maybe you care about your GPA. Maybe you just care about graduating. But ear training, if you're a musician, ear training is not one of those subjects. It is the raw material of sound, processing sound, remembering, understanding, translating. It's this web of skills, and it's not one skill. It's not just sight singing. It's not just dictation. It's a web of skills. It's connecting sound with symbols, with the instrument, and working both ways, from the notation and from the sound to the notation or to the instrument. So it's all these, I would say it's like a globe of things that are interconnected. And so to look at it as, I'm not going to prioritize that, is kind of saying I want to be an incomplete musician who has weak skills. I can understand that the structure of the course maybe is one thing and the inner skills are slightly a different thing. Excuse me. But the what I would suggest to a student, just to be more practical, is just make it part of your practicing. Mm-hmm. And understand that 12 minutes makes a difference if you do it 5 times a week. Mm-hmm. It's better to practice ear training 12 minutes a day than to do it for an hour on Saturday or Tuesday. It really is. And if you just want to rest your hands after you warm up and sing some things, have your ear training book with your guitar materials and sing something and then play it. Mm-hmm. Or, you know, sing the scale in thirds and then play it. Or just make up melodies and use solfege, which we use at Berkeley, movable dose solfege. I mean, it's just a system. I'm not going to, you know, it's not a religion. It's just a system that works. It's one of the systems that you could use for that purpose. It could be numbers or whatever you want to use. Sing some things and then play them. Just that is building those connections that I'm talking about. And it's going to make it easier for you to do all the things you want to do. Or listen to something and try to figure it out. But sing it and play it, you know. Mm-hmm. One thing I just think would make a huge difference is just to use your voice more. And I do that. It took me a long time to realize that myself. But, you know, when I finally realized that it made a huge difference if I sang something before I played it. Mm. If I want to emphasize one thing, is that if you want to build, your inner hearing is a serious long-term part of your memory. And we all have this little echo memory where if you go, you know, blah, 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 then the person can go blah, 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 back to you, you know, because that's how babies learn to speak all the languages of the world and how parrots learn to speak also. It's not very high level of activity. Or, you know, it's this mimicking, it's basically called echo memory. I mean, you know, they've located it in the brain. It's not the same place where you recognize the difference between major and minor when you hear it. It's just repetition. So if you play something and then sing it and play it, you're not doing that. But if you go like, what would that sound like? And you retrieve it from your deep long-term memory. Mm. And then you check and play it on the guitar and you go, I sang major. I thought I was singing minor, but oops. Now you've learned something. You know what I mean? That's going to stick. So you gotta do it the hard way.
Well,
but it's not that hard. It's fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing of using your practice time with intention. You know, yeah. I mean, it can be fun to just blow off steam and go in and jam on a Stevie Ray Vaughan vamp or something. I mean, everybody needs to blow off steam, but I think that's what you're talking about too, in terms of teaching students to approach it. You know, we have building blocks and we keep putting them together. But when you sit down to practice in that way, you're doing it with intention, so that it gets you out of that thing of I'm just pushing down my fingers and something comes out and you're not connecting with it. You know?
Yeah. I'm really, that's what I practice almost every day, and I structure my time, and I reward myself by that free, fun playing at the end. Sometimes I do a little bit at the beginning and the end, but I almost always do, you know, the scales and arpeggios. And one of the things I do is I put on a drone and I sing things and then play them. So I'm just, and even though I know I can do it, I do it anyway. And because it's creative and it's fun. And I try to use all 12 notes, you know, so if for somebody who's completed that process and knows that stuff, that's a way to do it. And sometimes I do it with a groove, and sometimes I do it rubato, you know. It's almost like an Indian music kind of a vibe in a way.
That's really cool. You know, Allan, before we started the official conversation, we were just hanging, you had mentioned something that I think a teacher of yours said about when we were kind of chatting about like what you would know about someone's musicianship by working with them on their ear. I don't know if you remember.
Oh yeah. That was my my college composition teacher, who was really an inspiring. He's almost like a Zen master kind of a guy, Ronald Lopresti, and his music is beautiful. And he was my composition teacher, and he would say these little gems to me. And one time I said, you know, I struggled with ear training. Let's say I struggled to get A minuses and A's. I got through it and I worked hard at it, but when I was an undergraduate, I was not one of the people who just was like, I already know that. Mm-hmm. Not at all. I had to learn it from the ground up, absolutely, especially singing. Mm-hmm. And I had some bad days and some good days, but I did work at it. I was a composition major, and I also was doing jazz and classical music. Anyway, he said, you know, every time you make a mark with your pencil in a composition, you're showing me what you can hear. Mm. You know, and it's not that, you know, that should be, I don't remember exactly what he said after that, but he made me feel like I'm not trying to intimidate you or insult you or make you anxious. I'm just saying that there are people who, you know, it's meaningful. It needs to be meaningful what you put down there. Mm-hmm. And I've been doing this longer, and your audience is going to include people who can hear everything. Mm-hmm. And so get serious and be serious, you know, and be responsible. You're responsible for what you're writing, and you need, you know, it's a priority to keep expanding your ear. This is what I took away from it. He didn't articulate all this. He was a person of few words. He gave me a few of those unforgettable gems, but he's like, you know, everything you play and write shows what you can hear.
Yeah.
And I think that should make it it's not intimidation, it's not to put anyone down, but it should make people who want to be good musicians inspired to work on it. I hope that it has a positive effect. Yeah.
Yeah, because you're really getting to take a look at, you have this opportunity to take a look at, like, what about all you've taken in can you demonstrate confidently? And then if there's something you want to demonstrate confidently that's not coming out, then you can go back and work on that.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's kind of if I had to think of a final thought that I'm taking away, I think it's that this should be, as you're saying, like kind of creative and empowering, and thinking like, this is your chance to kind of grab a hold of these things and make them work for your playing and really work on them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot. I know we need to wrap up, right? Are we near the...
No, we're getting there. We're like right about that time. We'd have to make another pot of coffee and do another.
Yeah, I mentioned that student, the rock guitarist, in my first hour of teaching, and she was the first person when I asked the class for a note, she was the first person to speak, and I got to didn't know her well, but I got to know her through the course a little bit more and what she did for a living and stuff. She was working rock guitarist, and you know why I was thinking, why does she stick in my mind, is because she had what my kids teachers call in elementary school a growth mindset. She was like, okay, tell me about that. I'll participate. Show me counterpoint. Show me things that are not necessarily obviously directly relevant to her identity and gig that year. But she wanted to learn more as a musician. And I don't mean to become a fugue composer or whatever, but to be a better guitarist in bands, you know. And I sensed that right away. I mean, some students are shy and some are outgoing, and that's all fine. And I don't want to judge anyone, but anyone's growth mindset just by their participation. But what I think students can do is just think about, instead of looking at this as a fearful or a thing they're afraid of, or a thing that someone else is making them do, like a hurdle put in front of them between them and where they want to go, to actually look at, like, I want to learn. It's just an attitude adjustment. I mean, I want us to adjust to the students too. It's not a one-way street. We're in a dialogue. But what students could do to make it more productive is to remember in all their classes and areas of their work that, you know, you have to say, I don't know, and I'm interested, and I want to know. Or I might be interested, at least. Let's see. Let's, you know, be a little curious and open about it, rather than immediately relegating it to the category of painful things I have to do that someone making me do, which is kind of a high school attitude about some things, or embarrassing because I'm not already good at it. You know, It's more like, oh, that's going to be an interesting adventure to go through that bumpy landscape of ear training and climb those mountains. You know, it should be like an adventure.
That's great. Ian, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, so that actually brings up a question that I've been asking everybody on this series. And that, like, you know, you have spent so many years, you know, first as a student and then as a professor, and then later on running some of these departments, you know. What's something that you've noticed that, or in your own experience being on both sides of this, what's something that maybe the students should be aware of or ask that they wouldn't necessarily have the wherewithal to know that they should ask that?
Yeah, I think how can I apply this to my playing is something that, you know, a little. It's not students' job to empathize with the teacher, but it might be helpful to the students sometimes to think about the fact that the teacher is teaching 4 vocalists, 3 guitarists, 2 music business majors, somebody who wants to be a film music composer. There's a lot of different things going on in the class. Some of the people already play a chordal instrument. Some of them have never played a chordal instrument. And so the teacher's juggling all these things and trying to bring everybody along in this complex, multifaceted topic in which everyone has different strengths and weaknesses about using their voice, about harmonic recognition, things like that. And the student, something that can get lost in that process, which is very challenging for everyone, is how can I apply this to my playing? And so I think if students asked that more, how do you practice this? What was the most successful thing you did to practice this? And this is something I'm hoping we're going to talk about next week with some of my favorite guitarists in the world, one of whom is here right now. Well, 2 of them are here right now. Maybe 3, and I don't know. But in the panel next week, we're going to talk about this. I would ask them, you know, how do you practice this, and how can I integrate this into my playing and daily practicing and growth, both while I'm in this course and in the future, which is a lot longer than the course. You know, our courses we have 2 years of ear training if a student goes through all 4 levels and is successful, and maybe they'll take an elective, which is great. But, you know, then you got about 60 or 80 more years to, what are you going to do with it then?
That's great. Cheryl, do you have any final thoughts for Allan?
Yeah, well, Allan, thank you for coming here and sharing all your wisdom, really. I mean, I was a student at Berkeley, and we used your books, course books, as students, so I learned from you then and now. And really, I think my favorite part about this was when you talked about your struggle with ear training. You know what I mean? I think that's so important, is that we all have, and we all started as beginners in some way. And also just it was really great for you to just talk about there is a process for this, and be patient and take your time, and you'll get there, you know? And we don't know how long that time, everybody works in their own ways, but I think, thank you for sharing that, because it's great to hear that from my point of view, and I'm sure for a lot of listeners out there, they'll be like, oh wow, Allan Chase struggled with hearing an A minor chord? Okay, there's hope for me.
Yes. Well, I've got to say that most of our faculty are the kinds of, they're very good at it now, and most of them are not people who aced it instantly, were placed instantly into, level 4 of everything. Most of them had to learn it and remember learning it.
That's great.
Yeah.
So Allan, you referred to a panel. And so for everyone who's going to be watching this, you can find the panel that Allan's referring to in a separate recording on our YouTube playlist. For sure, it will be a video recording of Allan and I interviewing Cheryl Bailey, Wayne Krantz, Lainey Stern, and Mike Stern about performance ear training topics. So you can go ahead and look for that. And thank you, Allan Chase. Thank you for being our guest on Coffee Talk.
It's my pleasure.
Cheers to you.
Thank you,
Cheers
Allan.
to you as well.
Thank you, Ian.
Cheers to all of you.
Thank you, Cheryl. And we'll see you guys next time, everybody.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.